Hello everyone and welcome to my Java tutorial series. In this particular episode I'm going to be going over methods. Now, a method is essentially a way for you to either A, condense a large amount of code, like several hundreds or even more lines of code, into a single solitary line that allows you to easily repeat that same amount of code without having to rewrite all of that code over and over and over again. Or B, it's also useful for organizing your code so that you don't have to be writing stuff having to do with printing messages to the screen, So for instance, let's just take like a sort of a text-based game, like a sort of an RPG-ish text-based game, so you have like a bunch of text and story stuff, and then you have to do like some mathematical calculation to find out the chance of, the player having some random event happen to them. Well, if you're reading that in the code, you have a bunch of like text, math, text. It can kind of just be, it just interrupts the flow of the program. So you could put that in a method to kind of, you could go look at the math part if you want to, but you can just kind of keep reading through and everything will just flow easier. So it's sort of an organizational tool as well. Alright, so with the basic overview of what a method is in mind, let's kind of jump into this. Methods can be a little bit confusing at first, but I'm going to try to give several different analogies on how they work so that people can understand, and we can muddle through this. It'll make sense. So if you're a little confused, just bear with me because by the end of this, you'll be a method expert, right? Hopefully. Alright, so this is a little program that I made a while back for one of my Java classes. Essentially, the goal is to simply just check if a number is prime or not, and I supply the number. So I'm going to run this real quick so you can see how it works. This is a problem. Let me change this real quick because I was having to rewrite some of the code that I made a while back, so for the sake of this tutorial. So here's the little message. You get a little message whenever you write this or open this, and then I just simply enter a number. So let's enter 7, which is a prime number. Your number 7 is prime. Okay? And would you like to check another number? Now, I don't think I've showed the confirmation dialog before, but it's like the message dialog or input dialog. It's just, it gives you like a yes or no that you can click, and it returns a 1 or a 0 depending on what the answer is. So if it's a yes, it's a 0. If it's a no, it's a 1. The only reason I know that is just because I just tested. I just what is it, and I just printed it out to the screen. So I essentially assigned it to a variable and printed that variable out to the screen to figure out which was which. But anyway, so if I click yes, it repeats, and I can do something like 4, which is not a prime number. 4 is not prime. I mean, I could even do something like 127, which I believe is a prime number. So yeah, it is a prime number. And I've tested this enough to know that it works, and I can use it reliably to actually figure out if a number's prime or not. So I'm going to click no. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize to all the headphone users right now. Alright, so if we take a quick look at this, figure out how this works. We've got 4 variables. We do the message dialog. We then got a while loop. We essentially get the number from the user. And then if we go down here, just skip over these two things. We go down here, we have the confirmation dialog, and then an if statement determining whether or not we press yes or no. So there's no math involved here. So what is with these two methods, right? What do they do that allow us to perform a whole bunch of math between these few lines? Well, essentially, this right here is performing all of that math. This right here doesn't do anything currently. It does absolutely nothing. But this performs all of the math, and it actually passes the number to check to that so that it can figure out what math, what number it's actually checking, right? If we go down here, we can see all of the math that is being done and how it works, right? So I'm not going to go into all the specifics of how it works, because that would require unnecessary explanation that isn't relevant to what we're doing right now. But all of this gets performed by this simple line right here. Okay. So, how do you create a method, right? We know what it is. We know that it does a bunch of code for us by simply doing this. But how do you create one, and then how do you call it properly? Well, I created a bare bones method. This is essentially, this right here is all that you need to create a method. Static void test method, and then you need parentheses and the braces. And the braces are necessary. You can't simply do like what you do in an if statement and just write one line of code below it and it'll work. The braces are necessary for it to work at all. Okay. I mean, in fact, it'll give me an error if I delete one. So if I do that, it gives me an error. Okay. So, all right. Now, what I've done up here is just I've written the name of the method out. That's the name of the method right there, right? And I just added the parentheses and then a semicolon. And that's essentially all we have to do to call the method. And so whenever I write this, all of the code that I were to put inside of here would get executed. I could actually write all of this. I could just copy it and put it into here, and it would technically work. However, I wouldn't have a number to be able to figure out what is prime or not. I wouldn't have a number to check, right? Because there's nothing in the parentheses here. There's nothing in these parentheses. I wouldn't have a variable to check. So the main difference that's between this method and this method is what's in the parentheses. Okay. So real quick, as far as naming the method goes, the naming rules are the exact same as a variable. So you start with a lowercase letter and then you just do camel case. And you can use numbers if you want to, you just can't start with numbers. So it's the exact same rules as a variable that you use for a method. Okay, so just don't use capitals. I know I said that whenever I talked about variables, but don't use capital letters for the very first word, because that's reserved for classes. So not that it'll really change the functionality of the program itself, but whenever people are reading your code, they'll think it's a class, just because that's the way it's done. So just do it the same as a variable. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. The inside of this parentheses is int input. This has nothing. Okay. Now, if we look here, we're passing number to check. Number to check is an int. Okay. So the thing that you put inside the parentheses is essentially what you're looking for. So if you want to think about it like this right here, this is essentially a package. We're wanting to send a package to isPrime. So we box it up in the parentheses, right? We put it in the parentheses and we box it up and we put a nice little bow on it or whatever, and we send it to isPrime. So it arrives at isPrime, and it has to say, like, isPrime is really, really paranoid, right? They're afraid of mail bombs and all this kind of stuff. So it only opens packages from people that it knows. So it has to recognize the person that it knows before it'll open the package. So it's only looking for ints. If it's anything other than an int, it's going to not open the package. It's just going to freak out, and it's going to cause the whole world to just implode upon itself, which is the whole world being the program, and it's just going to give an error, and it's my analogy, I'm trying to make it work. It's kind of falling apart at the seams here, but it's okay. So essentially, it's only looking for ints. Now we're giving it an int, so it's okay. But if it gets anything else, it's not going to work. So if I were to change this to like input's a string, so it's going to give me an error. Okay, so that's fine. So we're by whatever we say. Well, we could put an int, we could put a double, we could put a string, we could put a char, we could put anything we want. But the thing that we put there first, inside the parentheses, is what we're looking for, what kind of variable we're looking for. Now, the name of the variable has nothing to do with the other name of the variable. If you look here, it says input, but here it's a number to check. Now, I apologize for my coughing. I will make sure that I do not cough again. I will try anyway. Uh, if I go back and I put in input, you'll notice it gives me an error. But input and input here, it's the same thing, so that can be a little confusing. Yeah, I know it was a little confusing for me at first whenever I was learning about methods. It's like, well, but the same name, why isn't it working? Essentially, the name here and the name here don't have anything to do with each other. Partially because of a thing called scope, and partially just because of the way that methods work. I could give this the input in the method, I could name whatever I wanted. Actually, in the original code, I had called it number to check, but I actually changed it just so it would make a little bit more sense by being input. And it wouldn't be the same as number to check so as not to initially confuse people. But I could name it back, change it back to number to check, and it would actually work just fine, even though I have a number to check here. Because the variable name is only there for identification purposes. So if I send a package to France or Japan or Russia, and the thing that's inside, right, maybe I call it number to check, but it arrives in another country, they don't speak English, so they may call it, if they're in Russia, it may be or something like that. I don't know. I don't speak Russian. It would sound like Russian. Please don't hurt me, Russian people. Please don't nuke me. I'm in big trouble now with Russians. Okay, moving on. Essentially, the package arrives in another country. They may not speak English. They may call it something else, but it's still the same thing, right? It's still an int. Okay, so you can name this variable whatever you want. It's strictly for identification purposes because it is a variable in and of itself, right? I know I've been talking about the same thing for a long time, but it's very important to understand this because parameters is essentially what it's called. It's called a parameter, right? So, or an argument. It's called both. It's an argument or a parameter. And I think the correct term in Java is an argument, but in other languages it's considered a parameter, sometimes an argument. It's both, okay? But this is actually its own variable, which is why I'm using it down here, because I'm saying input, which is this number here, is this. So that's how I'm able to kind of get something and then apply things to it, because you give it a name and you're saying it's going to be an int and then you apply things to it. So technically right now input has nothing at all, but I'm still doing things to it. Normally in code, if we didn't have a number inside of something, like it's stored in a variable, we couldn't do like calculations to it, or we couldn't perform math on it or something like that. It would throw back an error. But because it's inside of a method, you can do that because it knows that you must pass some sort of variable that has something in it. Like if number to check didn't have anything in it, it would give me an error. So it's guaranteed to get some sort of number, because if we didn't have any code at all to even access any of the method at all, it wouldn't matter whether it had a number because it's not ever going to perform the code. So it's sort of guaranteed to have a number inside of input, which is why we can go ahead and write all of the code out of what we're doing with input. Alright, so that's sort of a extremely long and complicated example of how the numbers inside of here work. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know maybe a better way of explaining it. But aside from naming it and then giving it a variable name, I mean, we technically we don't have to give it a variable name. I didn't give one here, right? It's entirely up to you whether you or not you need to do a variable name. Because sometimes, I mean, there are plenty of cases in which you don't have to pass it a variable. And there are also some cases in which you have to pass it multiple variables. If we actually look up here at the message dialog, there's a null that we're passing, and then we're also passing a big string. So this is actually passing it two variables, because this is a method. We have the method name, and we have parentheses, and we're passing things to this. So this has two being given to it. Alright? Parse int. Parse int is a variable. We're only passing one thing, but it is a variable. Or I'm sorry, it's a method. Okay, and we're giving it input. So main is a method, and you can actually see that that it's looking for a string array. That's what the brackets mean. It's looking for a string array. Can't remember if I talked about arrays or not yet. Anyway, and then it's calling that args. So if I actually wanted to, the purpose of the reason that main has parameters to begin with is that you could actually set up handling of parameters. So if you wanted to launch the program with like an addendum of how you're launching it, you could. So, if you wanted to launch it and then like maybe you're using like Eclipse or something, or NetBeans actually itself, and you wanted to open straight to a certain file, you could actually add an addendum to the way that it's running, and it'll open straight to that file automatically. I don't know if that's actually possible or not, but that's just sort of an example of what you could do with args, right? You just give it something to do with it. So there's various examples of them, and if you wanted to actually create a method with multiple variables inside and multiple parameters that you're looking for, you just simply add a comma, and then you could do something like double test or something like that. Now if we do this, it's going to give me an error because it's like, okay, you gave me an int, but I'm still looking for a double. And I don't have a double, so give me a double, right? Now we could pass it null, which would essentially tell it null. Oh wait, is that not going to work? Okay, no, that's not going to work. I thought that might work. Okay, no. So we would have to actually give it a double for this to work, but since I don't want to do that, we're just going to delete this. Now, there are a couple other things to consider with a method before I just say that we're done. I mean, I've covered the name, I've covered the parentheses thing, but what about the public, the static, the void? What about that? I mean, this one down here this is the very basics that you have to make this work. So what does that mean? The static part, I'm not going to talk about in great detail because to really explain how it works, I would have to kind of bring up classes, and I don't want to talk about classes right now because we still don't have enough knowledge to understand those at the moment. I have to do an entire tutorial on that. So I'll cover static whenever I talk about classes more because that's really the only way to understand fully what it is. But just keep in mind that for static, the reason that this has to be here, technically, it doesn't have to be there. But because main is static, main has to be static. Again, I'm not going to explain why because that would involve having to talk about classes. But main has to be static. And because static methods can only communicate with other static methods, this has to be static, right? Because this is the only way for it to communicate. If I got rid of this, the method itself would be fine. I wouldn't get an error on the method. I would get an error whenever I'm calling the method because it tells me that it cannot make a static reference to a non-static method. So what that's essentially saying in layman's terms is that, hey man, you got to be static too because I can't understand what language you're speaking right now. Consider if something's already static, it can only speak one language, only communicate with other things that are static. But if something's not static, it can speak any language. I guess if you want to think of it like that. I'm coming up with analogies. I'm trying my best to because I know that this can be confusing. So I have to make this static to tell it that you have to speak the static language. Sort of. That's how that works. Anyway. So just know that if you're working with stuff in main, you just have to make them static. And again, I'll explain what static really, what is making the method actually do behind the scenes whenever I talk about classes. But anyway, the void is essentially telling it's a return type. Now void As that, if I may use a quote that I saw in a C++ thing one time about how to write C++, void is not a large looming abyss of complete nothingness and utter despair, but rather telling the method that it's not going to be returning anything. Now, if I were to type something like int right here, we could then do return int, or we would have to actually do return, we would just do return input, right? And then I would have to do int input. Okay, so now that works. So if we put int here instead of void, we're essentially saying that this method is going to return a number. And by return, I mean that we could actually assign something to method. Okay, I'm going to have to give this number to check now, because that's the only int I have available. Excuse me. So what we could do is we could actually do something. We could do number to check equals this. And there's no error, because test method is going to return a value. That's what the int being there is. It's going to return an integer value. So you can actually use this to perform mathematical equations. Say you want to find out the square root of something. So then it'll return an actual number. So you could just assign square root answer to, find square root method, and then give it the number to perform the square root on, and it'll just return it. And if you wanted to do that, it would still take one line. You would then be assigning, instead of having to do an entire block equation and then assign at the very end of that the answer, you could just do it in one line. You just assign the answer to the product of whatever's in the method, right? So essentially the same thing I would do here. It would just be with square roots and stuff. So it would just be equals this. So that's kind of how that works. This would be the new required steps if you have anything other than void. The return statement is mandatory. You have to have a return statement, because the return statement is whatever is the variable name there. So input. Whatever input is at the point that return statement happens, if the input is 1 whenever the return statement happens, it's going to assign whatever variable is looking for a number to be assigned to it. For instance, if I go back up here to number to check, so number to check is looking for for a number to be assigned to it, right? If number to check is 1, if input is 1 right here, so essentially number to check, right? That's what we're passing to it. So if number to check is 1, it's going to return 1. If number to check is 2, it's going to return 2. Now if we did this, if we did input plus 1 or plus 10, if number to, does that not work? Oh, I'm sorry. Equals. So if input is 1, it's then going to be 11, and it's going to return to 11, right? Okay, so whatever it is at the point of the return statement, that's it. Then the method ends, and then it goes back up. Okay? So you'll have to kind of make sure that the return statement is structured in such a way that you get the right answer that you want by the time that you get there. And you can only have one return statement. Now, the reason I say you can only have one return statement is I've tried in the past with the way that I've tried writing programs to actually have 2 return statements. To return a 0 or to return some other value based on an if statement. So if this is the case, return a 0. If this is the case, return a 1. If you're doing like a bool statement, or like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that you could then use in a switch statement somewhere else. But you can only have one return statement, so you have to kind of be careful about how you structure your program. Now you can put them in if statements if you want, but just keep in mind, again, once the program reaches that return statement, it exits the method and goes back. So even if you have it embedded in a bunch of if statements and while loops and whatnot, all of that will be canceled, and it is going to go straight back up and return that number the second that it reaches that one point. Alright, so most of the time you're going to want it last, but there are some cases in which you can have it sort of in the middle in some if statements and stuff if you are careful about how you do it. Anyway, so obviously we have to have some number in the parentheses. We have to be getting some number because we're going to return something. And in order to return something, we actually have to have something first. It's like giving a gift. To give it's like giving a gift. To give a gift, you actually have to have a gift to give. So you have to go to the store and buy one before you can give it to someone else. You can't just give them nothing. I mean, if you do give them nothing, you're a terrible person. But I mean, you can give them nothing. It's just rude. So don't be rude. Okay, I'm making far too many jokes this episode. Okay, so that's essentially that. And the return statement can be anything you want. It could be a string, right? If I do string. Now, obviously, that's going to give me an error because I'm returning an int, not a string. Okay, so I'd have to change this to string. Now, do keep in mind, I don't have to have this match this. I could have this be an int if I wanted to. But I would just have to make sure that I actually returned a string. So if I just do, string test. And if I return test, it works. Oh, I forgot the semicolon. Oh, I actually also have to assign it something. So that works, even though I'm getting an int here. So you don't necessarily have to always make sure that the first parameter and the return type is the same. You just need to make sure that you have some sort of variable that you're getting in here. I mean, I guess technically you wouldn't have to get a variable in there, but it wouldn't really make much sense unless you had a variable that you could return. I mean, I don't actually have to have that because now all of this is messed up. Because test, is that, and so I just return that. But in all honesty, it wouldn't make any sense to have a return statement without first having something and doing something to that and then returning that. Okay, so it really, at this point, this is just a glorified way of holding a variable, to be honest. It's just a glorified variable. That's all this method really is. So, it's not completely necessary for you to have something here, but either the very minimum amount of code that you have to make a method work would either be this, or it would be this, and I could get rid of this variable. Okay, so it would be one of those alternatives, where you have a variable inside of here that's assigned a value that you return, or you're getting a variable from here and then returning that. Okay, that's the bare minimum. But like I was saying earlier, before I got so rudely distracted by myself, you could do string, you could do a double, you could do a byte. Okay, you could do a char. You can do anything you want. I mean, you could do arrays if you want to. I can't remember if I talked about arrays or not. But, and then you can do void. So essentially you're not returning anything. And if you do write a return statement, it's going to give you an error. So you have to get rid of that. And then I guess I don't have to get rid of this, but that would serve no purpose now. So that's essentially all there is to writing methods. That's about it, really. Hopefully everything made sense. If something did not make sense, please let me know, because I have actually tried recording this tutorial probably 20 times now, trying to figure out the best way to explain all of this. So do let me know if something doesn't make sense, and I can try and figure out how to better explain that part and then re-record and re-upload. That's perfectly fine with me. So feedback would, of course, be much appreciated. And I guess I will see you guys in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.